chest. Okay, welcome back. I've just been reminded that you people have forgotten what it's like to have a conference in person. So you kind of like you take it on overdrive, this whole post-COVID thing. So welcome back. We are going to give this session its time as well. So our end time will be 4:30. So I hope you can bear with us because yes, we're getting excited that we are seeing each other in person. So Tina, I'm going to just hand over to you for this last panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindy Ware. Good afternoon, colleagues and comrades in the social justice space. I am now doing the last session, which talks about the personal practices in public administration. Now we're getting into state institutions, and this precedes our very own conversations earlier about the relationship between the state and the private sector and drilling down to procurement issues. But now we are going to talk about the practices, which obviously we had the National Development Plan that began to set the scene earlier on in 2010, which talked about specifically in chapter 13 about building a capable state, because South Africa aspires to be a developmental state. And there were some key issues that were highlighted in the document relating to specifically political administrative practices and the interface that was starting to emerge, where we saw that these relationships were starting to become more fractured as time went on. And this interface, touched on a very serious note that we also spoke about quite briefly here, the interference of political officials in the administration and their overreach, particularly in the procurement department. But as we have seen with the Zondo Commission report, this provided a much more in-depth insight, into what really happens behind closed doors in government buildings, but not only in government buildings, but beyond the public service working hours. In private residential areas of politicians, and also receiving phone calls from politicians, giving senior managers instructions on what to do concerning procurement of services in the state. So, this also brings me back to thinking about the case that I really watched quite closely during the state commission, the Zondo commission into state capture, when Ms. Pumla, who used to be the Director General in the GCIS, actually provided us with a very peculiar, case of what she had experienced. And her case also showed us the way in which, some officials were resistant, but other officials were complicit. And those who were complicit ended up having to compromise on their ethical values and their professional values, while others decided that they will not compromise and therefore became collateral damage, or should I say victims of the state capture project. So this really brought us to now what we are dealing with in the new reforms that are being proposed on the professionalization of the public service, and the way in which we can save the public service from the decapitation that it had experienced during the period of state capture. So today I have guest speakers who are going to take us through with their presentations and also their papers and positions in terms of how do we actually deal with the issue of professionalization, because it also deals with issues of depoliticizing the administration, deals with issues of now moving towards, a merit-based system of appointment rather than the politicized system that we have been subjected to, and also stabilizing the political administrative, wings of the different departments and state institutions, and also inculcating that culture of professional standards. How do we bring in these professional standards into the public service? So I hope these are some of the things that our speakers will cover. We have Ryan Brunette, who is a research associate at PARI, who will go first. And then we have Dr. Botshabelo Maja, who is the DDG in the National School of Governance. And then we have Fatima Rawat, who is part of the Ethics Institute. And then lastly, we will have Professor Maserumule, who's from the university, the Technical University of Technology in Tshwane, and he is the Dean in the Humanities faculty, and he has written quite a lot about the subject matter. So without wasting any time, Ryan Brunette, if you are online, can we have you as the first speaker? And I will be giving you precisely 10 minutes.
Cool, thank you. Just let me know if there's problems with hearing me and so on. I've been asked to speak to the Zondo Commission's findings and recommendations as they relate to personnel practices in the public administration. What those findings and recommendations are, do they omit anything, do they go far enough, what kinds of reforms are required to address state capture, and what can we as civil society and other interested people do to promote those reforms. Those terms of reference are very broad. So, the Constitution arguably conceives of the public administration as including the national and provincial public service, municipal administrations and enterprises, constitutional and public entities, actually the administrative parts of all organs of state. And that concept is itself complex and shifting. So I'm just going to kind of cut through this complexity by speaking generally across these various distinctions. And I'm also going to, in a certain way, cut to the chase. The Zondo report puts personnel practices at the heart of state capture. It asserts that, and here I quote, the Commission's investigation into state capture in South Africa is concentrated on irregular appointments, improper conduct by public functionaries, the concerted efforts and activities of the Gupta enterprise to gain control of governance. The Zondo report also has a clear account of what's wrong with personnel practices in South Africa. The problem consists in the introduction of criteria into appointment and removal decisions, other than the legally allowed criteria of ability, objectivity, fairness, and representativity. The law is fairly clear on this point in South Africa. So Section 195 of the Constitution stipulates that employment and personnel management practices must be based on ability, objectivity, fairness, and the need to redress the imbalances of the past to achieve broad representation. Section 197.3 provides that no employee of the public service may be favored or prejudiced only because that person supports a particular political party or cause. There's a limited exception. Section 197.4 requires legislation to regulate appointments of persons on grounds of policy considerations. This is currently under Section 12A of the Public Service Act, which provides for the appointment of a staff of special advisors in the offices of ministers. But apart from Section 12A, there's no statutory provision for political criteria, such as party program, partisan loyalty, and so on, to enter into appointment and removal decisions. The Zondo report recognizes, furthermore, that the introduction of considerations of party program, political loyalty, and so on into staffing decisions is, again in quotes, the essential mechanism of state capture. The reason, basically, is that it allows these decisions to be secreted away into opaque venues of party, faction, and clique. It empowers these groups to position loyal associates across constitutional and administrative checks and balances, which provides cover for the construction of corrupt syndicates and the illicit extraction of resources from the state. Everyone who's concerned about state capture, corruption, and the deterioration of public administration has got to a significant extent, focus their attention here. It's a fairly trite observation based on experiences from South Africa. We've been through a lot of this across the world, across history, that extensive politicization of personnel practices and public administration produces the sorts of problems that South Africa is experiencing around corruption, state capture, the deterioration of public administrative functions, and so on. I don't think this is particularly controversial. On this point, Zondo and I, at least, are in agreement. I want to argue, though, that In the Zondo report, there are also grounds for a serious disagreement, which has to do with the causal, legal, and partisan context in which we locate the trouble of politicization. I want to suggest further that this disagreement is going to become increasingly important to the politics of the country. So there's basically two contexts in which one can situate, the problem of politicization in South Africa. The first context characterizes politicization as a problem produced by the ANC's policy of cater deployment. The second context, rather, understands politicization as a more structurally conditioned, pervasive, and systemic process. So arguably, the Zondo report veers strongly towards the former characterization of understanding politicization as a problem of the ANC's policy of cater deployment. In the proceedings of the Commission, Mantashe, Ramaphosa, and others argued that cater deployment is simply recommendatory, an additional screen on statutory appointment processes, and ultimately a legitimate mechanism for ensuring democratic control of the state. The Zondo report spends a lot of time methodically dismantling these arguments. It finds that deployment isn't recommendatory but authoritative. It finds that it's not so much an additional screen on statutory appointment procedures as an opportunity to circumvent these procedures. And it asserts that this has actually come to undermine democratic government. In any case, Zondo concludes that ultimately that cater appointment ultimately unavoidably introduces political criteria into appointment and removal decisions, and so to take account of the recommendations even of deployment committees is impermissible in law and by implication unconstitutional. I personally prefer to characterize the problem of politicization in terms of the second context, right? I've long argued that the ANC's policy of cater deployment is a bit of a sideshow. The politicization of appointment and removal decisions in South Africa was originally produced by, and it's also sustained by more structural dynamics, right? When the liberation movement came into incumbency in 1994, it faced an entrenched administrative class that was historically programmatically opposed to, that it was socially distant from, and that therefore couldn't with reasonable certainty trust. In these sorts of situations, which are common in world experience, parties move to politicize. This is, you don't need a formal policy of cater deployment to pursue that kind of policy. If we understand cater deployment as a particular kind of like doctrine within within kind of like Leninist organizational practices, there's many parties of the right, liberal parties and so on, that have moved to politicize. Ronald Reagan moved to politicize, and so on and so forth, right? It's more the kind of situation that parties are in, their degree of trust in the public administration and so on. And then more enduringly, when political parties come to trust the public administration, when they've transformed them and so on. The politicization of personnel practices expresses basically the political usefulness of expanding the number and variety of officers along with the associated benefits of those officers, which can be offered as patronage to energize party activists and build border support and so on, right? So what I'm suggesting is that the ANC's policy of cater deployment does not originate and sustain so much as it formalizes and systematizes these underlying structurally conditioned interests in political control and mobilization. Now, this isn't like a marginal distinction that I'm drawing. It's necessary to understand this because it leads to the conclusion that getting rid of cater deployment isn't going to solve our problems. First, we know that factions and cliques within the ANC very often appoint and remove without the input of deployment committees. Second, and increasingly importantly, the other parties fairly routinely assert political preferences in appointment processes. A cursory look at our new generation of kind of coalition governments shows that this is widespread. There's lots of haggling around who gets to appoint who in the public administration and the committees and so on. So the issue isn't so much that the ANC has a formal policy of cater deployment, in my view, as that South African law as it governs personnel practices, both at the same time precludes political criteria from entering into appointment and removal decisions, then also provides no real check against politicians unlawfully introducing these criteria in practice. Put another way, in more constitutional terms, what we're experiencing as a country isn't the imposition of an unconstitutional policy by one party, so much as a statutory landscape that has facilitated a pattern of pervasive and systemic violation of key constitutional provisions. The appropriate remedy isn't to invalidate cadet deployment, but rather to reform the law so that political prerogatives and personnel practices are appropriately checked and balanced. The Zondo report itself often recognizes that cadet deployment isn't the end of the issue, because in key areas it recommends laws which establish such checks and balances on appointment and removal decisions. Right? So crucially, in the case of state-owned enterprises, it calls for the construction of a standing appointment and oversight committee constituted by the Chief Justice, the Minister of Finance, and so on and so forth, who will appoint people into this committee, and this committee will then nominate appointees to the highest offices of the state-owned enterprises. Right? Now, the distinction I'm drawing here between, the policy of cadet deployment and the broader kind of structural situation might seem quite subtle, and it's probably necessary to specify what the actual political import of emphasizing cadet deployment as an unconstitutional policy is, what the political import of emphasizing a broader social and legal context that encourages and facilitates a broad pattern of politicization, what the political import of that is, that characterization. The key issue is that, politicization is, as I've suggested, at the heart of state capture, corruption, and patronage politics. There are powerful interests entangled in it. This isn't a matter of a few wayward individuals. We're talking about large patronage systems that incorporate hundreds of thousands, if not more, people. Anyone that has familiarity with local government politics in South Africa will have a strong sense of the scale of these things. So this is a big system that we're dealing with, and the key issue then is that this issue is ultimately, in the next couple of years, going up into the Constitutional Court. Right? The framing of politicization as a problem of cadet deployment doesn't fully encompass the problem that we're experiencing. It can instead begin and can be framed as, and it can be used as, a partisan political weapon against the ANC. And what this does, if things are framed in terms of the key issue as cadet deployment and everything that goes with that, and if it's being used as a partisan political weapon, as I'm going to suggest it potentially is being used, then what this does is break what is an emerging multi-party consensus in favor of depoliticization of personnel practices in the public administration. And it starts to foreclose in significant ways more sophisticated, bargained, shared, and incremental solutions to the problem that we face. So the reason why I'm kind of getting at this is because effectively the Democratic Alliance has actually recently launched constitutional litigation in these terms. Right? In the Democratic Alliance's view, the key problem here is cadet deployment. The policy of cadet deployment ought to be declared invalid on constitutional grounds. And that's about the end of it, right? So the litigation that the DA has doesn't really have any kind of approach for what to do then, right? There's no real mechanisms established in this litigation to address this kind of thing. The ANC's policy of cadet deployment could be declared unconstitutional, and ultimately everyone will continue to politicize in any case, because many parties that don't have policies of cadet deployment do it anyway, right? This matter, this litigation is going into the High Court in January. It partly draws on the findings of the Zondo report, I think going forward, given that this is quite a weighty matter, the key role for civil society will be to figure out how to take the edge of this, right? The partisan edge, to begin to develop a broader understanding of the problem of politicization, one which doesn't throw the problem of politicization and also the constitutional court onto the horns of partisan politics, which instead facilitates dialogue and agreement across parties, which protects existing government processes to professionalize the public administration, and that works to move them forward in a more sophisticated way towards, legislative reforms that involve, for instance, establishing the Public Service Commission as a more robust check on politicization, and so on and so forth. So I think I may be running out of time. I'd be happy to discuss, those kind of like more concrete details more, but I think I'll leave things there for now and open it up to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for providing us with that political context, because it's quite important for us to understand the kind of bureaucracy that we have. And indeed, I do agree with you, we do have a very partisan bureaucracy in its nature. And I guess that's one of the reasons why we find that it's so difficult, to disentangle the political norms, from your professional administrative norms amongst your head of paid service and also the other senior managers who are involved in state institutions. And was probably your suggestion in terms of really how do we deal with the issue of professionalizing the public service is something that we need to play a much more proactive role as civil society in terms of dealing with the notion of what kind of a public service would we like to carve as state actors in the civil society space, because we are part of the state. The mere fact that we want to shape policy making in the state and influence the public sector bill when it comes to professionalization. So I will call up my next speaker, who is the DDG from the National School of Governance, because I understand that there are certain programs that they are trying to tailor to address these issues and inculcate a nature of professionalism in the public service intertwined with ethical behavior. So Dr. Maja, it's up to you to take us through the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. I will try my level best to stick to the allocated time. So we're talking about state capture and what the Zondo Commission findings and recommendations mean for public administration. And I thought that maybe I should begin here. Because you see, we have two things that we need to grapple with in South Africa today. There is this thing that I just call the intended. We all dream about this, that one day we will wake up to a South Africa that has a professional public sector, a state that is developmental. We will all be ethical people, because this thing of ethics is not a public sector issue. It's a South Africa issue. Maybe one day we will wake up as ethical South Africans, but we will also be capable. The reason why those blocks on the intended are so beautiful and organized is because that's our dream. Some people might call that a pipe dream, but I want to keep it as a dream, because if we call it a pipe dream, it means we are giving up. But that dream, you can see it sliding downwards, because on the one hand, we have this imposed space. All of us know we are number one in the world in terms of inequality. We are number one in the world in terms of unemployment. Our poverty rates are very high. Our crime rate is the third in the world. Yet all of this happens in a context where we don't have the right skills for the economy that we are looking to build. And we remain a society whose consciousness, Steve Biko, whom we're commemorating on Monday, reminds us that we need to deal with issues of consciousness. So that's a problem, right? So Zondo Commission finds us having all these problems, because all that Zondo Commission did was to magnify the problems that we've always known that we have. So keep that in mind. As we talk through my input, just keep in mind this problem that we are dealing with, that we are trying to overcome. Now, of course, two things that the Commission says, which I will touch on in various ways. It deals with the issue of accounting officers. Not all accounting officers, as the chair was just indicating, are corrupt. So there are those that are trying to act in good faith. And the Commission makes recommendations around how we need to protect those accounting officers. That's the first point the Commission makes around the public sector. The other one relates to a profession for procurement officers. So the Commission recommends that we must look at enacting legislation to establish a professional body to which all officials who work in the area of public procurement should belong. This is in report part 1. So keep in mind the problem that I mentioned at the beginning. Keep in mind these recommendations. So then my story begins. Ideally, we do want to have a capable state, and there are certain elements of this capable state that we are looking for. It needs to be ethical, it needs to be professional, it also needs to be developmental, right? So some of the colleagues earlier on were talking about how in focusing on problems of corruption, we overlook problems of delivery because delivery is equally important. So it's about this developmental state because when it's developmental, it should be able to deliver to its citizens. At the same time, it should be a state that is resilient, right? It's no use having a state that will collapse whenever any pandemic hits us. COVID-19 showed us how important this is. The floods that we have experienced earlier this year in KZN show us how important this is. You look all over the world with climate change, there are all these new ways that states are required to be able to respond rapidly. So we have to worry about this. So, you know, for as long as we are having a conversation about ethics, about corruption, it means that we are far away from rapid response, right? Rapid response to disasters. Because as long as you're talking corruption and ethics, it means you are far away from how you respond. So we at the National School of Government have begun to make an argument, and we are now making this argument before Cabinet that what we need to do, we need to put in place across the entire public sector a new cadre of public servants. We need new public servants that are committed, that are diligent, that are prudent, that are ethical. But we also say they need to be masterful and innovative. And the professionalization framework that is sitting before Cabinet as we speak talks about the need for us to build a meritocratic system of governance, which means whether you do cadre deployment, whether you don't do cadre deployment, it's immaterial for as long as your system is merit-based. And that's one of the arguments we are putting across Cabinet in terms of professionalization. Because when your public sector is merit-based, it's more likely to be masterful because you will have people who know what they're doing. It will be innovative in seeking new ways of doing things with precision. Now, we have a history, and I'm not going to bore you with this history. Our paperwork is not bad. You look at the RDP white paper that we have in place since 1994, a beautiful piece of paper. You can look at the 1995 white paper on transforming the public service, a beautiful document. 1998, we have a white paper on public service training and education, a wonderful document. We are not short of beautiful, wonderful documents that tell us the things we want to move towards. Yet, the achievement, the realization of statecraft mastery remains elusive. We are still not yet able to master statecraft. Why? Because we keep on having all these diversions around ethics that we should not be even be talking about, around corruption and so forth. And I keep on saying, for as long as we sit in conversations such as this one, and we have conversations around ethics and corruption, then we must know we are in trouble. Other countries that are moving forward are not discussing ethics and corruption. They are discussing mastering statecraft. how to set clear goals, how to build entities for execution diligence, how to make an impact, how to make sure that you cultivate top talent for the future, how you create space for innovation. So these are things that we are trying to trigger through this professionalization intervention that Cabinet is looking at the moment. So the National School of Government has all these interventions that we are aiming to have ready, so that as we professionalize, as we make certain interventions mandatory and compulsory, we are ready and able to have those across the sphere of the public sector, whether it be in terms of induction, whether it be in terms of economic governance, whether it be in terms of mastering the art of execution. Here's the thing that we are suggesting as we move forward, because it's not going to help us to belabor where we are and where we've come from. We are future focused. So we say we need to professionalize, and the need for us to professionalize has to allow us to achieve 5 things. 1, we have to be able to create a clear vision as to where the next generation of public servants will emanate from. Secondly, we need to be able to put in place a career system that is based on meritocracy and an ethical disposition. As I said, this is more of a South African problem. Thirdly, we need to institutionalize public sector itself as a career of choice. This thing that we have in South Africa, that you become a public servant when you failed everywhere else, has to stop. We want to make public service a career of choice. Anyone who ends up working for the state has to be somebody who's always wanted, wished, and planned to work for the state. And then fourthly, we want to be able to determine how specialist and professional skills will be reproduced. One of the problems we're having in South Africa is what we call this skills deficit. We need to be able to start reproducing specialized skills and professional skills, and then lastly, to be able to devise mechanisms to address the deficits and also to deal with the issues of inappropriate staffing. So this means we have to deal with these 5 things at 3 levels. We are suggesting that the first level we must deal with is what we term professionalization. Here we need to professionalize the sector itself. It's no use to have individuals who are professionalized, but whose environment is unprofessional. So that's the first part that we are focusing on. The second part is on the individuals themselves, and we refer to this as professionalism. So we would have to introduce systems, mechanisms, and processes that will ensure that those who work for the public sector are professionalized. Their disposition, their philosophy, their consciousness is such that it is professionalized. And then lastly, we talk about the discipline, and we say this is the profession. Here, that second recommendation from the Zondo Commission comes up. We are proposing that as we build this merit-based system, all public servants will have to belong to a professional body, not just procurement as proposed by the Commission, but all public servants must belong to a professional body. What we are doing with this proposal, we are introducing the issue of consequence management number 3. As things stand, consequence management in the public sector is limited to 2 players. 1 is the employer, 2 is the employee. Those are the only players as things stand who are the game players in terms of consequence management. We are introducing a 3rd player called a professional body. So we will legislate at some point once Cabinet has approved professional bodies to which different public servants must belong to. as part of their conditions of employment. What this therefore means is that should you be disbarred or removed from a professional body to which your conditions of employment requires of you to belong, this will have automatic implications for your employer-employee relationship. So this is the framework that we are suggesting in terms of the professionalization. It will therefore cut across 5 key pillars. Firstly, how we recruit and how we select public servants has to be managed and controlled. How we induct and onboard will also have to be managed and controlled.
Doctor,
Yes.
you only have 1 minute to wrap up.
I'm aware, yes, I'm going to do that. Thirdly, we will have to make sure that we deal with planning and performance management so that it is also controlled. Continuing learning and professional development will also have to be controlled, as is career progression and management of career incidents. So this is my last slide. And these are the key recommendations that we're making. Remember the first recommendation from the Zondo Commission. The issue of accounting officers. We are suggesting that there must be an appointment of a head of public administration who amongst his or her responsibilities will be to deal with career incidents of accounting officers. We are also suggesting that the Public Service Commission will need to put in place panels of experts that will assist executive authorities in the shortlisting and appointments of directors generals and deputy directors generals across the public sector. And of course, we're making all the other suggestions that you can see in front of you. I hope that higher education will join us in working on this, and we can also be partnered with the rest. Maybe let me stop here, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation. The good thing is that the presentation will be made available so that we can actually thoroughly go through these recommendations and also make suggestions and inputs about the realistic implementation of these recommendations. Fatima, let's talk about ethics. All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of the deliberations today. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to try and save us a bit of time. And I think largely from the work that we do as the Ethics Institute in partnership with our public sector partners, we work largely on collective action campaigns. So we work collectively with the public sector on various projects to gauge the perceptions of public servants in terms of the ethical culture of the public sector. And I think largely we can say that the Commission's findings resonate, especially around appointments and removals, are spot on, and they resonate with the findings that we find in the research that we conduct. Now, I've heard a lot today, the words around culture and ethical culture, and I think it's important for us to maybe just be clear, height challenge, thank you. So we use the word culture very loosely. And when we talk about it in the context of organizations, we say culture is the way that things are done. And when we talk about ethical culture, essentially in its simplest form, we're talking about the sort of culture where people do the right thing, whether someone's watching or someone's not watching. And when we talk the language of professionalization, this notion of ethical culture is at top of mind. And there are two projects that I want to integrate today when I share with you. We are currently with our public sector partners, COGTA, SALGA, and the Moral Regeneration Movement, working on a project called the Local Government Ethical Leadership Initiative. That project, incidentally, is going to be launched by the Minister of COGTA next week. And in addition, we've also worked with the DPSA, COGTA, and SALGA on the Public Sector Ethics Survey, and that's in its third iteration. So we've done it in 2015, we've done it in 2018, and we've done it now in 2022. And we've got some nice data that we're able to then benchmark in terms of the perceptions of public servants around the ethical culture of the public service. And when we think about the findings of the State Capture Commission, yes, but it's not just related to the entities that are mentioned within the State Capture Commission report. In fact, it's widespread across public administration. And as Ryan was talking about earlier, if you look at it in municipalities, it's particularly acute, given the closeness that politics have to the administration in that particular sphere of government. But in summary, our research points in the same direction as the Commission's finding, that inappropriate appointments and the inappropriate use of deployments are one of the root causes of corruption. And the system is fraught with this. And the sense from the research, or from the sense from the work that we do, is that it's difficult to implement deployment without things going wrong. And perhaps there was a time for deployment, and perhaps that time has changed. And now what we need is something different, something that calls, and hence the call for the professionalization of the public servant. So there's an adage in management studies that one builds a culture by who you hire, who you fire, and who you promote. But it's also about how you hire, how you fire, and how you promote. And that's simply because how we staff our organizations is in pursuit of the strategic objectives that we want to be able to fulfill. And the data that we have from the public service consistently points out the unethical environment that is perpetuating, but also that the link between the unethical environment and the appointment of inappropriate and incompetent people. When we ask everyday public servants, what do you think about the environment that you work in? They commonly feel across the board that the environment that they work in is not supportive of an ethical behavior. They're frustrated by these issues. They want to see change, and they would like to work in a more supportive, more ethical, more professional environment, and they are committed to making that change. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. So when we ask people what are their top behavioral concerns when they look at others within the public service or their peers, the two things that come out, or their most prevalent concerns, are around right people not being promoted and right people not being appointed. And also what the data gives us is a very strong correlation between institutions which have adverse or disclaimer audits and those same institutions being the sorts of institutions where people complain about political interference and corruption. So you can almost see that direct correlation between the disclaimer audits and the prevalence of corruption within those institutions. Also, in addition, maybe just to highlight from a morale perspective, the impact of then having inappropriate people being appointed into the institution, because what it does then is it demoralizes those that are willing to do better and are committed to building an ethical public service. These issues that I'm sharing with you are predominantly sitting in the public sector ethics survey, but similarly when we do work in local government, we see this come up really strongly. And one of the biggest issues that come up in the local government ethical leadership initiative that we're working on is around the separation between politics and administration. And this happens frequently when politicians appoint or deploy people into administration, and those people have political ties rather than the competence for the position. And this practice is done from the MM downwards into junior levels of administration, but it's particularly damaging when it happens at the senior management level. And the consequence of this becomes the degradation of the culture of professionalism in the institution. And we've all heard the language around loyalties and partisanship and what it does, and I won't repeat that. In terms of the recommendations from the Commission, we support those recommendations. And those recommendations, as Dr. Maja was saying, and Ryan before him, that they all essentially center on depoliticizing the appointment of leadership positions in particular. And it's important that we recognize that particularly the role of the depoliticization of the leadership echelons, and that the Commission's recommendations need to be extended across the political administration, across the public administration, insofar as it talks about leadership. Because the thing is that when you have inappropriate leaders, they abuse their powers. They don't bring in the right people. They do things for the wrong reasons. They don't have the skill. It creates an abusive environment, and employees then are unhappy. And so the cycle continues. And so we really need to focus on starting with our leadership echelons. Earlier this morning, when I heard the keynote speaker the focus a lot was, is there a map, is there a plan? And I think Dr. Maja was giving that to us in the form of the professionalization framework. It gives us guidance in terms of, well, how do we go about professionalizing the public sector? There's a lot of things that come into that list or menu of activities, but the critical thing, and perhaps the silver bullet, really talks to the issue of the appointment of leaders. And it's about getting the right type of leaders in, because if you're not going to start with fixing the leadership echelon, then everything else is superfluous, the training and everything else that follows. And so we really, in our work, focus a lot around depoliticizing, specifically around the appointment of the leadership echelons. And we strongly support the call for having professional organizations involved in the appointment of professional people, assisting with putting panels together, assisting with putting competency requirements together, because that also leads to the greater professionalization of the public sector. Please guide me for time. Okay, so I think the NDP, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, the professionalization framework are all giving us the how-to. And in the work that we do, when we asked everyday public servants, what is it that you would like to see? The verbatim comments that they come up with is that largely, and I'm summarizing, inappropriate leaders are incapable of holding those below them to account. And that's one issue that they, as everyday public servants, are calling for. In addition to changing or having the right sort of leaders in, it's also about a strong call for increased accountability. And for fair and professional accountability to become part of the system, one needs to ensure fair and professional top management across the public administration. When we ask people, what do you think needs to be done to improve? The things that they list are recruit on merit to promote professionalism, focus on recruiting, appointing, promoting, management, leadership, suitable qualifications, pre-screening and vetting. And those all become part of your personnel practices. What we need now is action. The NDP, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, the plan is there. What we need is for legislation to give effect to the changes that are being made, and we need for that change to happen. So the Public Service Commission should compose the committees that would appoint senior managers from DDG upwards. We also need to come to the sort of environment where our DGs are seen as CEOs, and they're able to appoint the right professional people who are able to bring about the type of organizations that they want to see. And as the keynote speaker this morning mentioned, there also needs to be political will. The change on paper is not enough. These changes need to be institutionalized, but we also need that leadership commitment and the political will to ensure that the integrity of the processes that we are putting in place are going to be upheld. Otherwise, it's superfluous. Concerted efforts to professionalize and instill a culture. Was I finished? Okay. 20 seconds, okay. Maybe just to end, I think when we talk about proactive ethics management, a big part about proactive ethics management is about making ethics real. And the recruitment and selection elements are critical in part of pro-ethics management. So when you want to think about the organization you want to have, are we asking ourselves enough of that question about what is the sort of organization we want to have, and what are we doing about building that organization? From a civil society perspective, I think we have a critical role to play as civil societies. I see many of my colleagues here today who work in the ethics and anti-corruption space, who actively contribute and work in partnership as collective action partners with government. We've identified the problem, we've been part of think tanks, but we also need to be part of the solutions. And there's a critical role for professional bodies to be played in this process, to be part of the State Capture Commission reports, implementing of the findings, be part of accountability, but it's also about holding government to account. And you just have to look at the lessons that we've learned from the introduction of the party political funding legislation and the active role that civil society played in ensuring that that became a reality. And so too, that is an example for us in terms of how we can actively play that role and make a positive change. I think I'll stop there. I'll stop there. Okay. All right.
Actually making us conscious of the fact that local government is still an outstanding issue, and it's becoming more complex because you find that a procurement manager is a branch secretary of the ANC So how do we deal with that? At least the legislation is trying to deal with that, that has been recently passed. Prof, you're the last one.
Good afternoon. It was quite interesting for one to go through the recommendation of the Zondo Commission, particularly as they relate to public appointments, and to just perhaps, in his logic, protect the integrity of the processes of appointing people into the public service, public sector in general. They made quite interesting recommendations, which essentially emphasize the fact that we should have so and so agency, so and so arrangement, and I just said to myself that isn't that Justice Zondo also is falling into a trap of what we call institutional fundamentalism. In other words, if there is a problem, create an institution and say that the problem will go away. Be that as it may, I think what the Zondo Commission has told us, particularly related to the professionalizing public administration, is not what we did not know. In fact, at the very foundation of our constitutional democracy, remember, we made a very important promise at the very foundation of our constitutional democracy. In the early 90s, we said that there shall be an efficient, non-partisan, career-orientated public service, broadly representative of the South African community, functioning on a basis of fairness and which shall serve all members of the public in an unbiased and impartial manner, and shall, in the exercise of its power and in compliance with its duty, loyally execute the lawful policies of the government of the day in the performance of its administrative functions. Close quote. Of course, some of you who were there will remember that this is one of the 34 principles which the multi-party negotiation process had forged a consensus on in the early 90s. It had called for the creation of a career public service system, and this principle has shaped particularly Chapter 10 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, where the basic values and principles of public administration are set out. I emphasize this principle because they constitute the fundamentals for professionalizing public administration. And one of the provisions key to staffing practices is that employment, and I think Ray referred to it earlier on, employment and personal management practices should be based on ability, objectivity, fairness, and the need to redress the imbalances of the past to achieve broad representation. You look at this clause carefully. All what it says in simple terms is that the public service should be institutionalized as a profession. It must be based on merit and espouse ethical values of probity, neutrality, and fairness. And the crafters of the Constitution were very sober in emphasizing this as key in driving democracy. And as I was in the ministerial panel on the professionalization of the public service, we did a comparative analysis of the constitutions of various countries in Africa, Europe, North America. And we found that South Africa's constitution prescribe the normative basis for the professionalization of the public service better than all the constitutions that we look at, to the extent that it has even established the Public Service Commission and assigned it the role of being the custodian of professionalism in the public service. But all these things are not new. Remember, in 1996, President Mandela put together a presidential review commission on the transformation and reform of the public service. It was headed by a well-known academic, Dr. Vincent Mapai, who later served in the first National Planning Commission, which produced the National Development Plan, which we often refer to it as a long-range plan which mapped the country's future as the blueprint for socio-economic transformation. The NDP had come to emphasize the necessity to professionalize the public service. I am saying all these things just to demonstrate one simple point, that since the foundation of our constitutional democracy, there has always been consistency in terms of policy choices as they related to the professionalization of the public service as the imperative for state capacity and institutional capability building. But all these were marked by prevarication and the paucity to follow through with attended actions. The NDP had come to emphasize the necessity to professionalize the public service more than a decade later, since the inception of the democratic dispensation in the early 90s. While it took almost 2 decades for the Constitution's basic values and principles governing public administration as the normative basis for the professionalization of the public service to be written into a legislation which sought to promote them. The legislation I'm referring to is Public Administration Management Act 11 of 2014. And the framework to facilitate the implementation of the professionalization of the public service, which Maja talked about, could only be initiated in 2020. And coupled to these are 2 key initiatives underway to amend the existing legislative framework governing the public service, which incorporate the recommendation of the National Development Plan on building a capable and developmental state. I'm talking about the Public Service Amendment Bill and the Public Service Commission Bill. What am I saying? As South African, we are brilliant in terms of putting our ideas on the table. We are so bad in following through. It took so much time for us to begin to seriously talk and act on the imperative of professionalizing the public service as key towards building a capable and developmental state. Let me just briefly talk about those bills that I refer to, because they also contain important provisions as it relates to all these issues that we talked about earlier on, particularly the question of political administrative interface. The Public Service Amendment Bill devolves the administrative powers to the Director General, who are the heads of the department, and the powers applied to human resource management and organization of their department. This bill aligns these powers with the Director General's financial responsibilities as prescribed in the Public Finance Management Act. And the Public Service Act, which this bill seeks to amend, assign the administrative power to the minister. Yet the Public Finance Management Act places the management of the public service on the Director General. So you see now the contradiction in law, and studies have shown that these contradictions have exacerbated conflicts between minister and Director General. And the NDP, remember, decried this as causing instability. To the extent that the latest report, which review the NDP, indicates something very shocking. It says that the average tenure of a head of a department in government most frequently lasts for a period of between 24 months and 48 months. And yet we talk about stability. And yet we talk about enhancing the capacity of the state. The NDP made recommendations on how to stabilize the political administrative interface. Fortunately, these bills that I'm talking about, to a very great extent, have incorporated these recommendations that came from the NDP. All what I can say is that these bills are long overdue. It just didn't have to take the Zondo Commission to jostle us into action about this important commitment that we've made in the earliest day of our democracy relating to building the capacity of the state. I'm going to skip some of the things because of the time, but I just want to touch on one aspect that Maja had talked about as it relates to the professionalization framework. I just want to make one point that professionalization of the public service is a shared responsibility. It requires collective efforts, but government should provide leadership. Another important point that I want to make is that academic government partnership is critically important to strengthen the source of talent pipeline. And another important aspect which we tend to overlook as we talk about talent pipeline is the significance of character formation when we teach the students at our institution. We only tend to focus on their cognitive faculties. In other words, creating technically savvy graduates who are ethically bankrupt. That is one thing that we need to talk about. And just maybe to conclude, a quick point that was raised by Rien around cadre deployment. The framework, at least the report that came from us, Dr. Buthelezi, talk about ditching deployment practices. And we did not talk about ditching ANC cadre deployment practice. We talk about ditching deployment practices because the fact that Party X does not have the deployment committee, does not take the minutes when they consider cadre deployment applicants, does not necessarily mean that deployment practice do not happen there. In other words, we cannot just only talk about ANC cadre deployment practice. Let's talk about cadre deployment practice as a general practice in the entirety of the system. In fact, when I was preparing my notes for the talk this afternoon, I came across a very interesting article which was penned by one friend of mine at the University of Cape Town, Professor Rawat Cameroon, and he said something very important, something very interesting. The article was published in 2003. In this article, Robert analyzed what he characterized as a controversial policy decision on the part of the then newly Democratic Alliance local administration in Cape Town to fire senior official of the previous African National Congress administration and to introduce an interim policy for senior managers that stated that such positions should be filled by people who are politically suitable and acceptable to the ruling party. Robert Cameroon was commissioned to come and review that policy. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the fact that other political parties do not have minutes about cadre deployment does not mean that they don't practice it. So let's just talk to the entirety of the system. I am going to end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think your historical lens into where we are coming from in the past 20 years deviations and also taking very long to consolidate the public service and its professionalism really provides us with a context of what it has been said, that we are a country that likes speaking but doesn't really take much action. I'm now opening the floor and I can see one hand in front of me. Another hand. Do we have any hands online? There's a third hand and then there's another hand at the back. Please proceed. We need a mic.
Thank you. I have a bit of a cautionary tale about professionalization. I once worked at an organization, a public service organization, that ought to be dedicated to public-mindedness and public interest. And this organization was mandated to provide universal access and equitable access to citizens. A very professional crew of people from Harvard, from all the right places, impeccable credentials academically, arrived, ironically, either from the mining industry or the banking industry. They immediately replaced citizen-mindedness and the equality of citizens with consumers. And that brought in a class hierarchy of affordability for a public good that is constitutionally entrenched and should be provided on an equitable universal access basis. Soon, the poor deserted the service. In the Nguni-speaking platforms of this organization, the desertion was so profound that whereas before they arrived, there were 25 million Nguni people who would attend and receive the service. By the time of the destruction of the service, the poor had disengaged. And then disengagement showed up at the polls as a crisis in liberal democracy. When we too narrowly define professionalism, and we see it in terms of technical competences and not frames of mind and ethical competencies, and we see it as contextual appreciation of where they are. You cannot have a banker presiding over an organization that's supposed to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots in the world's most unequal society.
Yeah, corporate management skills in the public sector. There's a next question. There you go.
Yeah, I just want to ask, I agree with Ryan and with the Prof here that I think the cadre deployment debate is a complete red herring, and I hope that the DA get whacked in court for what I think is just a stupid, opportunistic piece of litigation. But the question seems to me is, how far do you want political appointments to go in the public sector? You have the British system where ministers come and go, but the Mandarin stays where he or she, usually he, is, and says, yes, minister, and then just goes on and does whatever they intended to do in the first place. Or the American system where the population of Washington literally changes with every change in party, the party in government. I remember once doing research a long time ago on corporate governance and asking to interview somebody in the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, and got shown into this office of a guy with a very high-minded sounding title as advisor to the commissioner or something like that, in a nice office, and we sat in our respective armchairs, and I launched off on my questions about corporate governance, and he looked more and more bewildered, and eventually he stopped me and said, pointing to the picture of George W. H.W. Bush Sr. on the wall and said, Mr. Lewis, you must understand one thing. I'm sitting in this chair because I played a very active role in this man's election campaign. Come, I'll take you to somebody who can answer the question. And down I went to the basement, and there was a guy who indeed could answer the question sitting in a little booth. So what system does one want? Is it only the minister who should be a political appointment, which I don't think we can argue about, or should it go to the DG, to the deputy DGs, to chief directors, which is what would be the case in the United States, or do we? And a related question is that do we want the Labour Relations Act to apply to the senior management service of the public sector? Because I don't think that we do. I don't think that the CEO of ESCOM should have access to the Labour Relations Act, or the DG of any department should have access to the Labour Relations Act to protect their employment status.
Thank you. Can go ahead, third question, and then we get to you, Devi.
Thanks. Two questions. First one for Fatima. Fatima, you spoke about civil society holding government to account, but I want to go beyond civil society. You've seen what happened when Babita politely did her work. She wasn't born to be a whistleblower, and she was gunned down in a brutal manner. You must have heard of Ethel Williams fleeing the country into exile. And you must have heard of Martha, who has won various court cases and is still being dragged through by PRASA. So the question is, how do we ensure we can have accountability? So he talks to the people that raised the issue earlier about an emergency and making whistleblower number one on the priority. Next question that leads into the advisory committee that's been appointed by the president, NACAC. He's mentioned 36 months as a terms of reference. How do we, as a collective of civil society, ensure that it does not meet the same fate as the TRC? As we've heard, everything rests on Zondo Commission, the report, and us to fix and rebuild the country. Thank you.
That's it.
I'm just reading a question from the online Q&A. The question is from Faith Sakele on the TEI points. She says, ethics is not the same as practically engaging in ethical leadership. Some of the current leaders are not courageous enough to be set apart and advocate for morality, lest they lose opportunities for self-preservation. One may ask how often our leaders get coached and monitored on ethical leadership.
Thanks, Devi. Can we take some responses? We'll start with the members of the panel who are here with us. Prof, do you want to go first, and then Fatima?
Thank you so much. Just to start with the first comment, which I think it was quite important. In our first meeting as the ministerial panel, we sat almost half a day debating the concept of professionalization. And we're very clear that professionalization should not be understood within the neoliberal template of what we call the new public management, because it had fundamentally failed. We largely took into account the paradigms that were emerging in terms of how we should understand governance. I remember one important aphorism, which is quite instructive, was that government should not be run like a business. it should be run like a democracy. Our Botshabelo principle also to us were critically important because it compelled us that as we define professionalization, we had to add the element of the virtue of humanity. So, at least from our report, our conceptualization of professionalization is not locked in that new liberal naivety. The question of to what extent should this thing of cadre deployment go or shouldn't go? When one goes through at least the document of the ruling party, you realize that it seems as if the idea was that the position from director to a director general, right? Those are the positions that the governing party will have a particular interest in. Those are the positions that were subsequently characterized as senior management service, SMS. And it is quite interesting because if you go back to the original concept paper about senior management service, it was never really meant to be a particular hierarchy within the bureaucracy. It was meant to be a talent pipeline pool. In other words, it was meant to be an arrangement where senior management could actually be prepared to assume leadership position in the administration of the state, right? But along the process, and obviously this is the temptation of a party in power. Remember the American aphorism, to the victor belongs the spoil. So I think, and that also occurred well with the cadre development policy. And it is also quite interesting that after Vincent Mapai presented the report in the early 90s, the ANC said that it is too early to implement this. Maybe they were right, given the context of that time, because remember the report which I think came from HSR, Human Rights Research Council, did indicate that there is a threat that if the governing party does not really make some strategic political maneuvers in terms of the leadership of the public service, the African bureaucrats, senior bureaucrats that had to be inherited because the ANC did not come to power with experience, there was a serious possibility that they might actually sabotage the state, right? So in Mafikeng, they said that no, we got the cadre deployment. However, obviously, there is a huge misunderstanding within the ANC. But those that I interacted with did confirm that cadre deployment policy was never meant to be a permanent arrangement. It was meant to be an arrangement that was put in place to address a particular reality that existed at a particular point in time. So 30 years into democracy, we cannot still be talking about that, right? We cannot still be talking about that. And how long should we go? Perhaps if you ask the former president Kgalema Motlanthe will tell you that even the DG, it must be merit-based. Everybody, So there is still a debate about that, but yeah, maybe Maja will have something to say insofar as that is concerned. Yeah, that is all what I can say, unless if there is something in particular that I left.
Okay, thank you. To the lady who shared the narrative around your experience in your department, it just reminded me around a conversation that we've been having as part of the SA-EU dialogue around a values-based public service. And essentially, the message that comes from there is the importance of coming together on what are the values that inform our public service and what is the purpose of that public service. And ma'am, in your story, I think part of that narrative or that flywheel about how do we get towards a values-based public service is that once we come together and we understand what is our purpose and what are our values, and we have the kind of leadership that we need, and we've got competent staff, and they're able to provide direction, then do we get to what we need to do in fulfilling our mandate. But in your narrative, that went off right from the beginning. And I think it's really important for us to go here around the issues of values and our purpose as a public sector, especially when we talk around the language of professionalizing our public service. And then to your point also, the issue of context is important. Mr. Lewis, I think to your point, that our research certainly advocates quite strongly for an apolitical public service. So minister being political appointments, the office of the minister, the support staff, but everything below, as Dr. Maja, as Prof was saying, also should ideally be based on merit and depoliticized, is what we're getting back from the research. And the issue of civil society and how do we ensure accountability. And, you know, I think it's a lot about civil society using the platforms and the avenues that they have available and being consistent and being persistent and being able to create the change and hold government to account. And it's difficult and it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, I've seen initiatives from the Whistleblower House and others, for example, who are creating those opportunities to hold government to account, to provide support. And in our narrative today, it's also about civil society using those avenues to create accountability. I think the last point around ethical leadership, the matter around tone at the top is absolutely critical. And I just want to end by saying that when we ask people in our research, what is an ethical leader or who does an ethical leader look like, especially in the local government context, the elements around bravery, around courage, around moral courage, strong moral compass, competency and accountability come up tops in terms of defining what ethical leadership is. And I think it doesn't just stop at training. It is also about setting the tone and making ethics real within the organization. So I think that's the responses.
Thanks, Fatima. Let's get back to the team that is online. Dr. Maja, do you want to give us your input in relation to the questions? And then we'll move on to Ryan.
Yeah, well, look, let me just deal with one issue because Professor Maserumule has dealt with some of the issues. I just want to deal with the issue that Faith raised around whether we are mentoring and coaching around ethical leadership. The simple answer is that we are. But the real answer is that, you see, you cannot change messed up adult men and women. When adults are messed up, there's very little you can do. So all you can do is to fight fires. That's what we are doing with these adults that are messing up our country. We are fighting fires, and we must fight these fires as much as we can. But the real problem and the real solution is not with these old men and women. The real problem is with the young ones. I want to challenge everyone in this room today. When you get home tonight, talk to your 15-year-old, your 14-year-old, your 18-year-old child, and ask them what they think about the corruption, the lack of ethics in this country. You will be shocked what your own children will tell you around the moral compass that you are growing in your own home and the implication of that for our country tomorrow. That's where we need to focus. We need to focus on these young ones. We can still solve that one. It's still solved. We need to deal with that element with youth so that we do not plant this seed of corruption and lack of ethics that we are practicing ourselves. So the real solution, therefore, is with young people. And that's where we need to focus our energies more. These old ones, we have to hope that God does his job.
Brian, can you give us your views?
Sure. So yeah, I guess on David's question, which is I think a very pertinent one. So how far do we want to go with political appointments? So the two kind of standard models are the British system with permanent professional public administrators right at the top, or the American system, which allows for legalized political appointments down to the second or third layers of the federal public administration. So yeah, I mean, I think, just as background, the ANC has gotten itself in a bit of a tangle by adopting effectively the British system in law, but with kind of catered deployments on the side. The outcome is like, all sorts of incoherence, both within the system, but also, in the ANC's justifications of catered deployments and so on. So, this is what opens up room for stuff like the DA's challenge and etc. What it should have done is go for an American system, and it's entirely possible within the South African constitutional framework in my reading, which it could use Section 1974 legislation, which regulates appointments of persons on grounds of policy considerations, and so the way to do that is, instead of like narrowing that provision to staff of ministerial advisors, it would broaden it to include the higher levels of the public administration, DGs, deputy DGs. More kind of abstractly, which system is preferable? I tend to favor the British system. I think it generally provides for more integrity, more state capacity, and so on. It allows for policy direction by politicians, monitoring through a staff of ministerial advisors, and correction through disciplinary mechanisms if public servants are being wayward. I think it optimizes on South Africa's existing skill base by establishing kind of like a permanent class of public administrators with long service, continuous learning, and so on. It also crucially, I think, strengthens political administrative checks and balances, because politicians effectively find it more difficult to get into operations because there's, the DG is effectively not a political appointment, and so that's like the kind of barrier there. The American system, on the other hand, it relies ultimately on a very broad and sophisticated professional base in American society, with well-established avenues for elevation of professionals into government on a kind of, like 4-year basis, from the academy, from the legal fraternity, from policy think tanks, from business corporations, and so on. There are ultimately channels of kind of recruitment that provide for a significant degree of professionalization. South Africa, I don't think is quite there yet. If we were to go for the American model, we'd have to pay very close attention to, establishing those sorts of systems, creating room for folks with kind of professional skills to kind of move into the public administration and then, move out when their term is done and find employment, in law firms and then academy and all that kind of thing. So we have to establish those sorts of channels. Furthermore, like, in the American system, it's easier for politicians to reach down into operations. The political appointments play significant operational roles. And again, if we establish that in South Africa, we'd have to pay close attention and establish strong mechanisms for appointments to the permanent service lower down. So there'd have to be a kind of layer of that. That's more work for the Public Service Commission because there's more appointments to make and so on. But we'd also have to look fairly closely at how, what is the allocation of powers and delegations and so on, through statute, but also through kind of DG delegations into the administration. Where do those powers lie? And would an American system just allow, say, as would now, I think, political appointed DGs to appoint bid committees, which then swing contracts to political connections and so on? We'd have to pay very close attention to that. Now I'll leave things there. Maybe just like a quick note on labor relations. I think it does create problems. It makes it difficult to deal with corruption and all that kind of stuff. Having the higher service in the Labor Relations Act. What the Labor Relations Act does do is provide pretty robust protections for upper level public servants from kind of like purely political dismissals. there's a bit of a slog to get them out. And so we'd have to, we do want that, I think. We don't want political dismissals. And so we'd have to pay fairly careful attention to what we substitute the Labour Relations Act with. Thanks. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ryan. On that note, it's important to say that political parties will definitely come and go, but bureaucracies will remain. And I guess the important note is to ensure that we create resistant state institutions, especially now that we are faced with the probability of having coalition governments coming in 2024, and there won't be one political party with political principles, but many political principles heading different departments. On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tina. I will not take up time, but just to thank all the participants that are here in the room and those that joined us virtually, as well as the speakers here today. It's very clear to us that we've only just scratched the surface with the work that needs to be done and the conversations that need to be had. So mine at this point in time is to just tell you that tomorrow we start slightly earlier as per your programs. Registration is at 8, and we would like to be seated and starting at 8:45 as it says in the program. And then just to say that the guests or the participants that are using shuttles to the hotels, I think those shuttles are now waiting outside. So with that, please have a good night. We are pressing pause on this. We'll resume again tomorrow at 8. Thank you very much. Have a good night.